So I'm Ivanka. I'm a high school student from Minnesota, and I'm passionate about climate change and sustainability. And I first got interested in methane emissions when I did my research project at the U of M and also at Cornell. And they're both in reducing enteric fermentation methane emissions from livestock using feed additives. And so I started this channel, Methane Matters, after I learned more about methane to spread awareness to other people about methane emissions and their sources, impacts, and some mitigation strategies. So I have a YouTube channel where I make videos and also these podcasts. And then I also wrote this book about methane emissions that goes a lot more into detail than any of my videos. Yeah, I'm really excited to have you on the podcast today to talk about all your exciting work.
And it's so nice to meet a fellow methanogen. That's very impressive, the work that you're doing. So.
Thanks. Okay, would you like to introduce yourself?
Okay, I'm Neal Blair. I'm a professor in the departments of Civil Environmental Engineering and Earth, Environment, and Planetary Science at Northwestern University. I have to think about it because we just changed the name of my second department, so I never get it totally right. I started out when I was an undergraduate as a chemistry major, not thinking at all about methane or even the environment that much, though I grew up in the country. I actually grew up around farms, and so I was naturally at home with the outdoors, and I just liked to look at things and spend time out there, but I never thought about wedging that into a career. It was just who I was. I grew up in the country, and I was a country kid. But I discovered I was very good at chemistry for reasons I still don't understand, but it just came naturally to me. And so I went on and got a PhD in chemistry at Stanford. Still not quite sure what I was going to do with it, though I was discovering that I was not in love with chemistry for chemistry's sake, which could be a problem when you're getting a degree in chemistry. But I loved using chemistry to study things. Okay, and I'll explain what that means in a bit. After I got my PhD, I got a postdoc and I went to NASA and worked in the extraterrestrial research division, where we actually studied extraterrestrials, not living things, but actually things like lunar samples and meteorites. And this is where I first met methane, in that a person at NASA, became a good friend, wanted to study gases that were in a meteorite and figure out where they were coming from. And it turned out methane was one of the gases. So how does a meteorite, which has no life on it as far as we know, or doesn't come from a place that has life as far as we know, how did it get methane? And so we devised methods to analyze the methane and try to figure out where it was coming from. Now, as it turned out, at about the same time, NASA was trying to figure out how to get into the climate science business. So they were seeing NSF do climate work. They were seeing NOAA do climate work. And they kind of felt, gee, if we're going to be relevant, we need to do climate work too, but we don't want to duplicate other people. And so someone high up in NASA thought, no one's working on methane. And we have satellites that can detect methane. We do atmospheric studies all the time. This could be something that NASA could do really good. And so I was at NASA during the early years when they were planning the program. And that's kind of really how I got wedged into it. Because I saw that here's a thing that I could get into right at the ground floor that I was just starting to learn about. And then ultimately I got hired at North Carolina State University into a department called Marine, Earth, and Atmospheric Sciences as basically a marine chemist. Even though I did not know any marine science, but what I did know was I had some unusual analytical chemistry skills that allowed me to analyze things like methane and the precursors to methane in natural environments in ways that no one else had ever done before.
Okay.
And so that was really how I started up my arc and did multiple years of research in coastal systems looking at methane emissions and how methane was made.
Wow, that's really cool. So what kind of projects are you doing currently?
So most of my research right now is trying to understand how does land management and mostly agriculture influence the carbon cycle.
Okay.
And so to give you an example of one of our main focuses is that it's well known that when you're doing agriculture and you're tilling, for example, that you're losing carbon, organic carbon from the soils. They start to become very depleted in carbon, which is not a good thing. And we don't know where that carbon goes. We know where it generally goes, but we don't know how much is going back into the atmosphere versus how much of it is going into the lake downstream or what's happening to it. And what's more important is we don't fully understand why we should even care yet.
Okay.
In other words, does it matter at all that this carbon's moving across the landscape when we do agriculture? Or is it a really bad thing, like burning fossil fuels? And so that's really what our research is doing, is trying to understand what happens to this stuff and how should we be worried about. So what a good example that's pertinent to your interest is that we discovered that an awful lot of this carbon goes into reservoirs, which are basically artificial lakes that have been created to manage water for agriculture, for instance. And a lot of that organic carbon gets converted to methane. In fact, this is one of the most important sources of methane, anthropogenic sources of methane that we know of. And so this is a good example of how agriculture is actually making lots of methane. Besides the animals that you know so well, this is another issue.
Yeah, that's interesting. Are you also doing work with any animals?
No.
Okay.
We have not gotten into animal research at all.
Okay. So what does your lab and like team composition look like?
Okay, so the lab is, our laboratory is a organic analytical chemistry laboratory. In other words, we have instruments like mass spectrometers and infrared spectrophotometers and other types of instruments that allow us to identify what kind of organic compounds we have in soils and sediments.
Okay.
And that allows us to learn where that stuff came from. So I'd like to call it's kind of like an environmental forensic tool. You know, like in forensic shows, they're always analyzing compounds and saying, oh, this person did the crime or whatever. We're not looking for people. We're kind of looking for processes and locations, like, oh, this agricultural field might be producing the organics that we see in the lake, for instance. Now, the types of people that we have, it's a very diverse group. I mean, today I've got one person, but in the past we've had bigger groups. It kind of ebbs and flows. But we have everything from undergraduates to graduate students working on their PhD to postdocs, and all sorts of disciplines. So we have people who are chemistry majors, geologists, ecologists, engineers. Mostly I'm looking for people who have strong skill sets in something. In other words, they know how to do something well, but have a real interest in being interdisciplinary. In other words, they want to learn from other people and learn other languages. And I don't mean foreign languages, I mean scientific languages. Like if you're a chemist, if you've ever tried, it's really hard to talk with a biologist and understand them, and vice versa. And that's one of the things that I think we do extremely well, is we break down those barriers and we have people from different disciplines talking with each other, because it takes a team to study something like organic carbon or the carbon cycle or even methane.
Yeah.
As you would know by now, you need all kinds of people. You need a village to really understand.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about like the tools and technologies you use in your lab?
Yeah, so one of my early specialties, in fact, why I was at NASA, I want to learn how to use stable isotopes as a probe into how to study processes. So have you run across stable isotope use at all?
Not really.
Okay, so it's really critical for methane. In fact, some of our earliest information about why atmospheric methane has been increasing has come from isotope measurements. In fact, this is why I got so interested in it, because I was helping set up a isotope lab at NASA. They had hired a new person, and then I was working with him to basically set the lab up. So, do you know what an isotope is?
Yes. It's like a
It's okay
different,
if you say you're not sure.
yeah. No, I don't know how to explain it. Maybe you can do that.
Okay, let me explain to you. So, an isotope is a form of an element, say carbon, that has a different number of neutrons.
Yeah.
Okay, so what distinguishes elements from each other is the number of protons in the nucleus. So if we were to change the number of protons in carbon's nucleus, we wouldn't have carbon anymore. We'd have nitrogen or something else. However, we could change the number of neutrons, and it doesn't change the element. It just changes the atomic mass. So for carbon, we have carbon 12. That's its atomic mass. And carbon 13. And both of those are what we call stable isotopes. In other words, they will last forever, as far as we know. They'll last for much longer than we will. However, there's another isotope that's called a radioisotope. You want to take a guess what that is? You've heard of it.
Have I?
Yep. And you don't even know it. Carbon 14.
Oh, okay.
Okay. What is carbon 14 used for?
I don't know.
Dating.
Oh, yeah.
You want to figure out the age of something like a fossil bone or an old artifact. We like to do carbon 14 dating on it. And the reason is that when you put in that extra neutron into the nucleus, it makes the nucleus unstable. So the radioisotopes are considered unstable isotopes, and they start falling apart. Now, some of them fall apart instantly, like in milliseconds or microseconds. And then some of them literally last millions and millions of years. And it turns out carbon 14 lasts 5,730 years. That's its half-life.
Okay.
And so if you know that, you can actually count the number of carbon 14 atoms you have in a sample and figure out approximately what the age is when you compare the number to whatever's in the atmosphere. Okay. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's basically it. And so you could use the stable isotopes and the radioisotopes as sort of source indicators. So this is how we figured out where the methane in the atmosphere is coming from. So we know methane's increasing, but how did we figure it out, where it was coming from? Well, we used the stable isotopes, told us a little bit that it was probably somewhat biogenic, in other words, coming from biological sources, because it turns out the methanogens have what we call a very big isotope effect. In other words, they'd like to use the lighter isotope over the heavier isotope. It literally takes a little bit less energy to move carbon 12 than carbon 13. And so it turns out that the methanogens, there's a big isotope effect, so that the methane that's made from it is isotopically rather peculiar. It's very carbon 12 rich compared to other things that we might look at made of carbon. Carbon-14 even puts a finer dot on the picture in that it actually, because there's so much carbon-14 in atmospheric methane, we know that it was made recently and not a million years ago, like fossil fuel methane,
Okay.
which has no carbon-14 in it whatsoever.
Hmm.
And so it turns out about 80% of the atmospheric methane looks like it came out of the atmosphere recently.
Wow.
And so so this is where NASA came in, because NASA's looking at these things and they're going, well, here's our problem. We have these guardrails that are put on it with the isotopes. Can we now start figuring out what are the recent sources of methane and where's it coming from and how much from where? And so first thing that NASA wanted to do was send out a bunch of people around the world to collect methane samples from different things, from cows, from turbine mounds, from landfills, from wetlands, and measure the isotope ratios in all of these to see if they could get it matched up with what's in the atmosphere.
Okay.
Okay, seemed very simple, except that my collaborator and I totally messed them all up. Because we went to one field site in North Carolina and decided, let's just measure the methane coming out of this site every month for a year.
Okay.
See if it's the same number all the time. And what we found out is that there was a very strong seasonal variation in the isotope values of the methane.
Interesting.
And that, of course, had everybody tearing their hairs out because it meant, oh, we just can't go to and collect a sample from a cow and assume that's going to be the same everywhere you go every day.
Yeah.
Or a wetland. And so it really totally complicated the whole sampling strategy. And where I went with it was I wanted to know why. Why is it changing? Because if we understand why, maybe we can lessen the burden on how many samples you have to collect. Because it was going to be too expensive to collect all the samples you would need if you had no idea why it was changing. You know?
Yeah.
No one could afford that project. And so that's where I kind of went, was I went and tried to understand what is going on in the system that was causing the isotope values to change. And what we discovered was that there were two basic methane producing pathways. Have you learned about those in cattle and other animals, what the microbial pathways are?
Yeah, a little bit.
So there's the CO2 reduction pathway and the acetate fermentation. Well, it turns out those two have different isotope effects.
Oh, okay.
And so when those pathways are changing, then the isotope values change. And so then that led us to ask, why are they changing? And that led us to figure out that there was something about the microbial ecology where one group of organisms was out competing the other under different conditions. And so that was kind of how we went. That was the road we went down as we were studying. So it's convoluted and it's complicated, but it kind of illustrates how much there is to learn in just the method story.
Yeah. So how do you hope that people use your research to help reduce methane emissions?
Well, first it starts with understanding how methane's made and under what conditions it's made. I think that's really important so that you can predict things. So we can't possibly go around the world measuring methane everywhere.
Yeah.
So we need to have models or descriptions of how it behaves. And the better those models are, the more predictive we can be. And that really lessens the analytical workload that we have to do. And then hopefully leads you to mechanisms that you could attack that might allow you to lessen methane emissions. So as you probably have gotten into this, if you're working with people at Cornell, one of the things people are looking at is how could you create an antibiotic, for instance, or that would knock out methanogens selectively that could be fed to cows so they wouldn't make methane. So that's an example of where knowing how things are made leads to a potential solution.
Yeah. So do you ever collaborate with other universities or government departments or anything like that?
Well, actually, the project that I described to you with the agriculture and the reservoir is part of a big multi-university project.
Okay.
That's actually part of an even bigger group that's funded by NSF. So it's called the Critical Zone Network. Have you run across the Critical Zone yet?
I don't think so.
Okay, so this is kind of a trendy newish. It's not all that new. People have been talking about the critical zone since I think 1980s, but it really has come into fruition, I think, really more in the last 20 years. The critical zone is basically that part of the planet that's really critical to us. And scientifically, we tend to describe it as from the rock layer in the soils and the soil surface up through the soils into ecosystems to say to treetops. Okay. So it's kind of like treetops down to the rock and everything between. So it's soil science, it's ecology, it's hydrology, it's atmospheric science. It's all those things that are working together. And I think that's the unique thing. It's not that we haven't had people studying forest ecology or soils. We have for a long time, but they tend to work in their specialty. And the critical zone concept is the expression of the need that we have to have all these groups talking to each other.
Yeah.
And working together and understanding how, the soil chemistry is not just soil chemistry. It's a product of the rock that was converted to the soil, as well as the ecosystem above it and the atmosphere and the water flowing through it. It's all these things over time, okay? And so it's a big, you got to be able to put your mind around a rather big project. And so NSF decided to fund a series of critical zone programs. We are one of 9 that were chosen in the recent decade that our specialty is basically looking at what we call the intensely managed landscape, which is code for agriculture. In other words, how does man's behavior impact how the critical zone behaves? And so, I don't know, we have 5 or 6 universities as part of this in the Midwest.
Okay. Yeah, that's really cool that you guys are, yeah. That's really cool that you guys are collaborating.
Most of my research projects have been big collaborations. Before I came here, when I was at NC State, I was doing oceanography. And that's a very collaborative interdisciplinary science in its own. So if you go out to sea on a ship, there's always going to be people from different universities and different disciplines on that ship working with you in the same region where we sample.
Wow. That's cool. So do you have any international products, or are they mostly like based in the US?
We have had international projects. Right now, I don't. We've worked off of the Amazon River. And we worked off of New Zealand. Papua New Guinea is another place that we've done research. The similarities, the thread in all those is that there are rivers that we've been studying, and we started out trying to understand how does the river influence the marine chemistry out near the mouth of the river. And of course, they ultimately led to, well, what's influencing the river chemistry? And there's always people involved, so we moved into that as well.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So we
So-
wanted to study big rivers like the Amazon,
Mhm.
which was the trendy thing. Basically, funding agencies like to fund big rivers because
Okay.
they feel like they get more bang for their dollars.
Hmm.
Well, if they're going to throw $1 million, say, at studying a river, they can't study every river in the world because there's tens
Yeah.
of thousands of rivers. And so they'd rather, nice thing about the Amazon is it delivers, we think, maybe about 20% of the fresh water into the oceans. It's such
Oh,
a big
wow.
river. I
Yeah.
don't know that we really know the number that well, but that's a number gets through. And so if you're going to study a river, the Amazon's a logical one.
Hmm.
The Mississippi's another logical one. It's very big and it comes out of the US and the Midwest. And so, okay, makes sense. It's our river, our big river. And so for a long time, NSF really did not want to study little rivers because their attitude was there's just too many of them. We can't, if we study one, what good does that do? Type attitude. No one ever quite said it that way, but that was the message. But then our group pioneered studying small rivers on the Pacific Rim because we discovered that they had a rather unique chemistry.
Interesting.
So studying a handful of those rivers actually gave us insight to what a whole family of rivers going around the Pacific Ocean would behave like. And it stood up to time as other people started. Now it's very popular to study small rivers because people saw that their chemistry was pretty unique.
Okay. Do you ever study anything besides rivers, like lakes?
Well, I've studied there's a reservoir in Illinois
Okay.
that we studied and looked at carbon cycling in that, including methane production.
Okay.
Wetlands we've studied.
Yeah. Wow, that's really interesting. So what kinds of challenges do you face when doing your projects?
Well, the first challenge is getting funding
Mhm.
for research. There's just never enough funding to study everything you could possibly want. Plus,
Yeah.
we've got so many people who are coming up who are interested in this thing for good reasons. So it's very, very competitive. They say
Mhm.
something like 10% of research proposals get funded in our field.
Wow.
So that means for every one you get funded, you probably may have to submit 10 of them to keep trying. So you have to be determined and patient. And then once you get the funding, there's just the issue of getting into the field and collecting samples under the right conditions. Nature doesn't always play nicely with you. So, for instance, we were studying this river, the Eel River in Northern California.
Okay.
And one of the things that we had a hypothesis that so it was not a dammed river. This is back up. And so what we call a wild river, which meant that when it had a big rainstorm, it would flood.
Okay.
So a lot of rivers in the US particularly have dams on them. And so when it rains, the dams kind of hold back the water. And so, yeah, there's a little bit of flooding, but nothing really dramatic unless it's catastrophic. And so they're kind of tamped down. That's the purpose of dams. However, the eel was very notable in that it was very flashy. If you had a big storm come through, you would have this big pulse of water come down, and within 3 days, if not sooner, it would show up in the ocean and leave these great deposits in the seabed that were literally records of storms over years.
Wow.
And so we got interested from a marine perspective. We started looking at the sedimentary record and we could see all these storm layers. And so we start studying the chemistry and it was weird. In fact, it would just left us scratching our heads. It was not like anything in the literature. This was how we discovered these small rivers were unusual.
Okay.
And so it got very interesting from that standpoint. So we got a proposal funded after an attempt or two. The first one didn't work. To basically study what was going on during storm events in this river that made it so unusual. because we didn't know any better. And so we went 3 years, and it was almost a drought. There's like no storm events.
Wow.
I mean, little rainstorms, but nothing like we want to see that was going to leave a deposit. So we went through the whole project without having a rainstorm.
Oh, that's unfortunate.
Then the year after, they had a big storm, kind of like it's going on now in Northern California. That was what we were looking for. We never. Okay. So, those things happen. If you're doing oceanography, the weather can be bad and you get chased out and you can't collect samples, or equipment could fail. And so we were doing a lot of submersible work at one point, going down in submarines. And if the weather's bad, you can't put the submarine in the water. Or if something goes wrong with the submarine, you can't put it in the water. And so there was one cruise we went out for 5 days, and we never got into the water. We just had to sit there and twiddle our thumbs. And that was that project. That was that cruise, totally lost. Okay. So there's the sample collection. And then you get the samples back in the lab, and then you have to do the analyses. And hopefully all the instruments are going to work, but they don't always work.
Yeah.
Or you have to have the right people in the lab. Maybe the people you have, or maybe you don't have people at the time, or enough people, or whatever. You have to have people trained up who can do all these things. So, I mean, the point is that there's all these moving parts. It's kind of like, I don't know if you watch any sports, but it's kind of like having a sports team. And to win, it's not good enough if 1 or 2 people play well.
Yeah.
Everybody has to be playing well, particularly if you're playing the game of the century type thing. And so your field work, your project, really to you, because you may never have another opportunity to do this project, but you have 3 years typically, the funding agencies will give you. And if things don't work out in 3 years, you don't get anything. So it's, it's challenging. It's a miracle we get anything done.
Yeah. Do you travel a lot for your work?
Used to.
Okay.
I'm just not doing, I'm literally 6 months away from retirement.
Okay.
So we're in the process of kind of shutting things down. But in my early years, yes, we were going out to sea. I mean, I had 1 year where I think I was out to sea during my birthday. I was out to sea during my wife's birthday, and I missed my son's first birthday.
Oh.
And when I showed up at home, the poor little guy, he was just a little over a year old, looked at me, and I could tell in his eyes he did not remember me.
Oh.
Eventually, recognition. I mean, it took a few minutes. Eventually, the recognition went off, but that was kind of heartbreaking. And I realized, okay, I've got to be careful.
Yeah.
Because I've got to balance things here. I just can't be going out to sea all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. How much time do you think you spent on the field instead of in the lab?
Well, much more time. So I'm an analytical chemist. So there's no question that I probably spent 95% of my time in the lab. I mean, when you consider a research cruise might be a week to 2, at maybe 3 weeks, and you might do that maybe once a year, maybe twice sometimes. In that 1 year, it was 3 times. It really still ends up you're in the lab most of the time.
Okay.
Now, some people are very field oriented. So in our discipline, we have the people that I call the field generals. They are the people who are just excellent at doing the field work. And they love being outside all the time. I'm not one of those people. I help out, but my specialty is I'm a lab rat. And so they will come to me saying, can you analyze this for us? And I'll go happily. And so that's why, again, another example of how the team works. And then there are modelers. There are people who are just really good at doing the math. so they can take the results that we have and then develop models that will predict what's going on, what went on, and then what could happen, even if we don't have analyses to prove it because we can't get out there. They try to project forward with that, or between sites. Like we studied one site. What if we go to another site that's a little different? And you do the calculations to see what it would do. So, there's a handoff. It's like a baton race where these things are hand off to different groups sometimes.
Okay. Yeah, that's nice. So I think I have one last question. What advice would you give to someone like me or a high school student who wants to go into a field like this?
Oh boy. I would say become good at something.
Okay.
Okay. It could be science, it could be chemistry or physics or biology, it could be social science because there's all this human element interaction with all of these things. But I think when you come out of high school and you come out of undergraduate school, what my feeling is that the single most valuable thing that you come out is that you have a skill set that you can say, you can say, I do this well. But I'm not sure it matters what it is, because we're dealing with such an interdisciplinary science. The other thing, which you're doing quite well, is take the time to read as much as you can about a topic like methane, to try to understand all the different ways people are interacting with that topic. Like you'll find there are chemists, there are atmospheric people, there's ecologists, as you found, microbial ecologists, and animal ecologists, and you go on and on and on. There's questions like, so a fascinating question in the methane space is, how could you teach methane to the general public so that people would care? Because you've got this gas that no one can detect unless you have a fancy instrument. Right? You can't smell it, you can't see it. It's invisible to everybody. And to the average person, maybe if you told them it's a trace gas, they'll go, why do we even care?
Yeah.
And so if you just said, well, it's a greenhouse gas, that's already lost on a lot of people. Most people we don't feel greenhouse gases very well. Not yet. I mean, maybe if you lived in a coastal environment and you get hurricanes, you would care. So to me, that's the great social conundrum that we have, is how do you take this incredibly complex observation, methane's increasing in the atmosphere, and get it to people who are partly responsible for decisions of policy, because even if they're not making policy, they're voting for people who make policy. Plus, they have day-to-day actions that are important, like, oh, maybe we should eat less beef. Okay. And to me, when I told deans here at Northwestern, when they asked me, what should we, if we were to hire the next generation faculty in this general space, not methane specifically, but the environmental space, what should we do? And I didn't say an environmental scientist. I told them we need people in environmental social sciences.
Okay.
Because our biggest gap is what I just described to you, is getting from the very high-techy realm, which we're doing such wonderful things in. It's mind-blowing what we do and the needs we still need from people like you. But how do we get from that to making good decisions?
Yeah.
And scientists have failed at that. So that's the thing to think about. That's why I love about what you're doing, because you've actually taken a really good step for that. I mean, making a booklet, having a podcast, you're trying to bridge that divide that we have.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. So you're retiring soon. What are your plans after retirement?
I have no idea, and I'm loving it.
Yeah.
I want to have time
Mm-hmm.
not dictated by meetings and classes. I enjoy everything I do. I mean, it is fun, but it does wear on you after decades, half a
Yeah.
century, literally, um, of having my time programmed for me.
Mm-hmm.
So at some point, I'll want to do something significant again, probably. But right now, I want to just sort of take a break. Maybe it's a year, I don't know, of kind of exploring, doing some traveling, seeing things I haven't seen yet before they disappear.
Yeah,
Uh,
that sounds fun.
and just thinking about things. There's a lot of writing, so I've got so much data from students' theses and stuff that need to be written up in papers. So that would keep me busy 100% of the time, is just writing up papers
Okay.
and
Yeah.
thinking big picture. Like, okay, like questions you've asked, like, okay, let's not get mired down in the weeds with all the technical data. What have I learned in the big picture that maybe I can say uniquely because of my experiences that might be of interest to people or useful?
Yeah.
That's in the back of my mind, still trying
Hmm.
to figure it out. It'll probably be something to do with rivers. And my pet idea is to treat rivers as a signal propagation
Okay.
system, like an artery. Okay, so you think of it, you take out a blood sample and then you run all kinds of analyses on it and you diagnose the body.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, could you do the same thing with a river? Since rivers are kind of like arteries of water flowing over the landscape, can we come up with kind of a conceptual model
Hmm.
that would say, if we sample the river here, here, and here, can we interpret all that chemistry in terms of a signal that's been moving through a system, like through a circuit? And what can we learn about the system? That's my pet paper.
That sounds interesting.
So we'll see. It's
Yeah.
going to take, but I
Yeah.
need quiet time to think about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it'll be nice to have a break.
Yeah. I mean, I
Yeah.
like to say I may be thoroughly bored with it by Christmas, but who knows? That's okay.
Yeah. Well, it was super fun talking to you and getting to know all about your super exciting work.
I appreciate talking to another methanogen, or, or as it should be a methanophile is what we should call you.
Yes. Yeah.
So
Yeah, for,
what's your next person? Do you have another person lined up?
I don't know if I have one lined up right now, but I have a few that I'm talking to. So hopefully in the near future.
Okay. Are you picking people by disciplines, or how are you pick? I'm curious. Like, of all the methane people in the
Hmm.
world, you found me.
Yeah.
And you probably did not know you were going to get into rivers and lakes and stuff that much. So are you picking things by topic, or referrals, or how do you find people?
So I started with just looking at university professors and like researchers, and then it kind of branched from there because like one person will say, "Oh, I can't do it, but maybe you should talk to this person," and then it kind of like goes from there. Yeah. Yeah. Um, great.